So we're going to start what would be our chapter 22. So this is 18, but you're watching this on the Wednesday before Easter. And so this is chapter 22, talking about the diversity of life. And so what we're going to talk about is essentially this image right here on your right, which are that there are three different domains of life: eukaryota, bacteria, and archaea. And so you can see here that all animals, well, that's not going to show very good. All animals are going to be sorted in this sort of triangle. Why are these all so terrible? There we go. The domain is going to be the ones we're talking about today, and then they're going to be sorted by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So it's a classification method known as phylogeny. Okay. So the first group we're going to talk about is bacteria. Bacteria are, and remember, you're supposed to be taking your notes on paper to submit to me. Bacteria are diverse. Some bacteria are autotrophs, remember, like plants, and then so they photosynthesize. Others are heterotrophs like us, so they must take in their energy source by eating, like we do. Most bacteria are single-celled, but others gather in clusters, so they exist in like groups. Bacteria reproduce asexually by dividing, but most occasionally exchange some genetic material. Bacteria vary in shape and have some flagella, remember, like the little tails, for locomotion. Important functions of bacteria from a human's point of view: well, they break down organic matter, release carbon for photosynthesis. They help make nitrogen available to living things. Some produce vitamins in the bodies of humans. Some prevent harmful bacteria from infecting our bodies, so we have good bacteria and bad bacteria. And some bacteria are essential for making cheese, yogurt, and drugs. And so things like probiotics, lactobacillus, that's a type of bacteria which is really good. And so it's in yogurt. And probiotics, if you take those, they'll have different strains of good bacteria. And so that's why it's important to, one, not take antibiotics unless you absolutely need them, because antibiotics will kill all of the bacteria, good and bad, in your body. The second domain are archaea. And so archaea are not bacteria. They are a distinct domain of prokaryotic organisms. Some archaea are called extremophiles that thrive in harsh, salty, or very hot environments. Others are chemoautotrophs that make food using chemical energy from molecules such as hydrogen sulfide. So if we go back and look at this image about the domains, and we look at archaea, halophiles, thermophiles, so those fall under archaea, pretty much the two main groups. Bacteria, you have the cyanobacteria, which are the autotrophs. They're also like green algae, and heterotrophic bacteria. And then the group we're going to talk about next, which is the eukaryota, that's where we are. So protists are eukaryotes that are not plants, fungi, or animals. They may be single-celled or multicellular. They reproduce through asexual or sexual means. They can be autotrophs or heterotrophs. Protists are diverse, and they include many seaweeds, diatoms, amoebas, disease-causing organisms such as Plasmodium, which causes malaria. Okay, so that's the group called the Protista. So let's talk about plants. Okay, so now we're over here in the, so you see down here in the eukaryotes we have the basal protist. Well, that's the ones we just talked about. So now let's talk about fungi, another kingdom. So plants are autotrophic, meaning they photosynthesize. They're multicellular, terrestrial. They grow on land. Eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus that obtain energy through photosynthesis. Plant adaptations to the terrestrial world includes the fact that they have roots, shoots, leaves, and a vascular system. So they have a breathing kind of circulatory system similar to kind of like what we have. Plant reproduction occurs through alternation of generations. So the plant life cycle will alternate between a haploid, which is a gametophyte, and a diploid, which is a sporophyte. And the details will vary plant by plant. Okay, so it's not always going to be the same type of reproduction. Mosses and ferns. So mosses are, make sure I don't skip a slide. Mosses are small, seedless plants with no vascular system. Every part of the moss has to absorb water directly via diffusion. So most of the time we find these, if you've ever been into like a stream that had really slippery rocks, that's probably moss, and it's green, kind of looks like carpet or astroturf. Ferns are seedless plants with feathery leaves. Most live in moist or shady habitats. So we see here ferns are pretty typical on porches. They make nice big plants and they have leaves that spread out. In fact, I think there are certain types of ferns that if you touch their leaves, you run your finger along, they'll actually close in response to that sensation. Seed plants have two key features that makes them successful in many habitats. They have what's called pollen, which is an immature male gametophyte that can be transported to female gametophytes by wind or animals. So pollen is like the yellow stuff that gives our allergies the fits every year, but it's part of the reproductive system of a plant. Seeds are embryonic plants that are encased in a tough outer coating with a food supply. Flowering plants usually will surround the seeds with a fruit. So if you think about like fruit trees, the very middle, the seed part, that's what we're talking about right here. So the fruit falls off or it's eaten, and the seed is either one ejected through, whatever eats it passes through its digestive, drops the seed somewhere else, or the seed will be picked up and moved somewhere else, or will be planted where it falls. The two major types of seed plants are ones that are flowering and then your conifer plants. And conifers are like the green trees that we have here in East Texas. And so the flowering, or the female portion of the green pine trees that we have is the pine cone. And so the pollen falls inside the little hard shells on the pine cone, and that fertilizes the plant. So if we have a seed plant, this is kind of what its life cycle looks like. You have a mature sporophyte in the flower. Inside you have this kind of diagram in number 2 where you have the female gametophyte. So this is what needs to be fertilized, the egg, the sperm, and then once the pollen hits, that's where it's going to hit the very top of the flower, and that's where you have the male gametophyte. Then the seed, the flower dies off, the seed then gets transported and becomes a sporophyte seedling, which will then later on turn into a mature sporophyte, ready to then reproduce. Fungi are more closely related to animals than to plants, which is kind of strange to think about it, because they are heterotrophs. Fungi may be single-celled or multicellular, which means they either have one cell or multi, and they can reproduce sexually or asexually, so meiosis or mitosis. Many fungi are decomposers. They play a crucial role in terrestrial systems. So the fungi are things like mushrooms. They're part of so we tend to have mushrooms around dead things, which is kind of strange, but sometimes that's how they'll find bodies that have been buried. They'll have a lot of mushrooms growing in that area. And I only know this because I teach forensic science. And so they'll find a lot of mushrooms growing around the area where a body's been buried. All right, so let's talk about animals. And we're in a very shallow way going to cover the different kingdoms within the animal family. So animals are multicellular, heterotrophic eukaryotes that obtain nutrients by eating something else. Most reproduce sexually and are diploid, so we have 2 sets of chromosomes during most of their life cycle. Or not diploid, but 2 different cells. In this case, it's going to be the sperm and the egg. The gametes, sperm and the egg, are the haploid stage of the life cycle. So when they come together, they form a diploid, meaning 2, and that's you. This drawing shows the evolutionary relationship among the various animals. So you can see the way it works, the branch that goes up from like the middle to the far right that says chordates. Well, that's the common family tree line, and each branch is basically where something has adapted or there's been a speciation event, but they're classified differently from each other. And so you can see we have sponges, cnidarians, flatworms, roundworms, arthropods, mollusks, annelids, echinoderms, and chordates. So we're going to go through them just briefly. Sponges. Sponges are sedentary marine animals. There's an image right here on the slide for you. Special cells in this sponge will beat the flagella that move water through the sponge. So it basically is like it has fins, and the fins are going out grabbing water and blowing the water back and towards the sponge. When this happens, it allows the cells to capture food, digest it, and then distribute nutrients to other cells. So it's kind of like fanning yourself with your hand to distribute wind on your face. It does the same thing with the water. And as the water passes through the sponge cells, it's able to grab any nutrients that are in the water and then pass it out. Cnidarians include jellies, sea anemones, corals, and hydras. They have two distinct tissue layers separated by a jelly-like middle layer. They have tentacles to catch prey. So you know that if you've watched Finding Nemo, which I think I've referenced that now twice in these video lectures, they have the tentacles which you don't want to touch. They'll sting you. And then you have basically the top or the head of the jellyfish, which is not electrified and cannot sting you. But that's where all of the important material is housed and protected, because their mouth is actually right there at the center of where the tentacles come out. So oddly enough, cnidarians alternate between a sedentary polyp stage and a bell-shaped medusa stage. So the stage we see here is called the medusa, although some groups will exist primarily only in one form. So corals stay as polyps, which are just like sedentary things at the bottom of the ocean that don't move, but they do grow. And jellyfish are the medusa, so they stay in the medusa stage. But things like a sea anemone, they go from a polyp to a medusa stage. But they're classified to be all in the same family. Arthropods include crustaceans. I'm going to slaughter all of these names. I'm going to say ticks, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, and insects. So I don't expect you to know the specific names, but if you can give me examples of things that might be under an arthropod. If you think about teaching a elementary school kid about what a centipede is, well, they're an arthropod, and they're going to share similar characteristics to that of a spider. They're not going to know Uniramians. I don't even think that I know how to say that correctly. All of the things that these have in common are here: an exoskeleton, segmented bodies and jointed legs, a brain, and they have developed sense organs. So that makes them distinct from the groups we've talked about so far in a way. The exoskeleton means that their skeleton is on the outside, kind of like body armor. We're an endoskeleton. Our skeleton is inside of our body, covered by tissue, and so they're the opposite. Their skeletons are on the outside. Segmented bodies means they actually have distinct head, thorax, torso, legs, things like that, where they're actually distinct pieces, as opposed to sponges that just look the same all the way throughout. They have a brain, and they have developed sense organs, so like hearing, seeing, tasting, things like that. Mollusks are soft-bodied animals. Most of them will have some sort of protective shell. They use a muscular foot for locomotive. Visceral mass holds the digestive and the reproductive organs, so they're going to be held kind of in one portion of the body. And then the mantle secretes the shell. And so mollusks include clams, scallops, which are bivalves, and then you have squids and octopuses, which are cephalopods, snails and abalones, which are gastropods. So very different environments. Clams and scallops obviously live in the ocean. Squids and octopus do as well, but snails can be found, and abalones can be found on the ground, terrestrial, or in aquatic. Okay, so mollusks. Annelids are segmented worms, such as earthworms and leeches. The muscles of earthworms are oriented both in the circularly and longitudinally, providing flexibility and motion. So if you've ever played with earthworms, you know that they can flop and twist about they're very flexible, but they also have the little rings or the segments, which will allow it to have that flexibility. And in fact, earthworms will have a head and a tail that look very similar, and that's a way to trick predators so that they may try to grab the tail instead of grabbing the head. So echinoderms include sea stars and sea cucumbers, and they have what's called endoskeletons, so very similar to us in that regard, and tube feet. So these are little feet that stick out at the bottom that help them move along. They're kind of like suction cups, and so they are able to pick up and move along and suction at the bottom or underneath rocks. So it's the way that they move about. Now chordates are going to include all of these groups: tunicates, lanceolates, and vertebrates. And so we're under the vertebrate group. Okay, so we're chordates because we have a spinal cord. So all of the ones in this group, the chordates, are going to have some sort of spinal cord, vertebrae going on. So all chordates have at some point in their life history a brain and a spinal cord, a notochord that supports the back, gill slits, and a tail. So some of these features are obviously not apparent in adults, but human embryos do go through a tailed stage. And so that's what classifies us under this, okay? As well as the gill slits. So vertebrates include many groups of fishes. So fishes have a backbone, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Okay, so that's this group right here, vertebrates, all the way from hagfish to mammals. So the other vertebrates you see: reptiles, amphibians, lungfish, coelacanths, this is turned sideways, coelacanths, ray-finned fish, cartilaginous fish, and lampreys and hagfishes. Okay, so amphibians include salamanders, frogs, and caecilians. Many will have aquatic larvae, so they have them in the water. But they will be terrestrial as adults. So they are called amphibians because someone who's ambidextrous uses both hands. If they're amphibians, they live in, or they have a tendency to occupy both environments, aquatic and terrestrial, which is ground. Most of these have to live in a moist environment to protect their skin and their eggs, so it's important for them to live in an area where there is water because their skin will dry out. Salamanders, frogs, and caecilians. They all are vulnerable to pollution and environmental contamination. So down where I grew up, which is outside of Austin, there's a town called San Marcos, which I'm sure you guys probably know San Marcos. But they have protected the salamanders down there because due to pollution and things like that in the river and other important sites where they've habitated, they're becoming an endangered species. And so there's a group down there who's focused on just protecting the salamanders to prevent them from going extinct completely. Okay, so reptiles and mammals share something in common, and that's that we're amniotes. We have skin that's made of dead cells. Sounds gross. Reptiles shed theirs. We shed ours. And we have shelled eggs. We're well adapted to diverse terrestrial habitats. So meaning we can exist in a variety of places. Reptiles do include birds. All reptiles other than birds are called ectotherms. So ectotherms regulate their body temperature behaviorally. So if you've ever known someone with a snake or another type of reptile like a bearded dragon, they have to have usually a lamp or a light for them to get under because they can't regulate their own body temperature, and they need a lamp or a light in order to stay warm, or else that they would die of like cold shock, even though it's not hot or it's not cold to us, it's too cold for them. Birds and mammals are endotherms, so we are able to maintain a constant body temperature by metabolizing, it's just large amounts of food, but we have to, if you don't eat and you're not eating enough, one of the symptoms of being calorie deficient is the fact that you will feel cold because you're too deficient in your calories, which is something that's common in the older generation because they have a loss of appetite due to a variety of other things, but they tend to feel very cold-natured for that very reason. Okay, so birds and mammals, we share that in common. So mammals, how do we define a mammal? They must have hair of some sort. They must feed milk to their young. They are endotherms. They can be terrestrial, aquatic, or able to fly. And they include monotremes, which have egg layers like a platypus, marsupials, like kangaroos, or placentas, like humans. So if you go back to this thing where it says shelled eggs, well, we obviously don't have a shelled egg, but our placenta and the marsupial and the monotremes are very similar to the egg-like shell structure. It has something encasing it, has the amniotic fluid, and then the baby. And so in an egg, it would be the eggshell, the yolk, and then the actual sac. I mean the yolk, and then the clear liquid around it. All right, so a little bit of history and science. Classifying the platypus. I remember learning this in like 5th or 6th grade, but it is pretty interesting. The platypus has a duck-like bill, so looks like a duck, walks like a duck, is a duck, right? Has webbed front legs, which suggests it's a great swimmer. Clawed hind legs, which is used to climb trees or to climb things. Thick fur, so it has hair. A cloaca, which is something that's shared in common with birds. No nipples, so meaning it doesn't feed milk to its young, and it can lay eggs like a bird. So to the first English scientist who saw it, the platypus was a mystifying combination of a bird and a mammal, which we just said reptiles and mammals are separate, and birds fall into the reptile category. So interesting kind of animal there. I've never seen a platypus in person, or even at a zoo, but it just looks like a croc got stuck on an otter's face to me looking at this image. All right, so let's talk about viruses. This is just crazy that we're talking about we're ending with viruses when COVID's going around right now. But viruses have characteristics of both living and non-living things. That's what makes them so tricky. They have no cells. They only reproduce within the host of a cell, so they have to invade your body, and they basically occupy your cell, and they're able to replicate once they're there, which then causes the immune system in your body to go haywire. They do have genes, so they are able to pass on their genes, which they do quite well once they're in a host cell. And then here's the kicker, they evolve. So we know that viruses over time can evolve, and unlike bacterial infections where we can use antibiotics, we don't have a wide tool belt for treating viral infections. We do have antiviral agents, but we usually don't like to use them unless they can pinpoint exactly what you have, because they're not very effective, and they're not good for your body. You know, the side effects of taking them is more so harsh than if you would just suffer out the virus for a few weeks. And so this is the last slide that you have to worry about for